Today I'm going to talk about the characteristics of both change agents and coaches, and these overlap. So before I go into the characteristics, I want to provide a bit of context and research and then tell a short story, a personal one. I will leverage off some of my personal experiences as we go through this. So there was a paper written by Laura Delazona in August 2017 in the Harvard Business Review. And she describes the fact that change agents fall into the category of highly effective people. They need to be nurtured and protected. High-performing teams need psychological safety. For all the coaches among you, you will know that this is absolutely critical in order to explore, develop, be supportive, and be emergent. So before I go into the detailed characteristics, I'll talk a bit about my daughter. 2-3 years ago, my daughter came to see me. We quite often have brunch together on a Saturday morning before everybody else has got up in the house. And she was quite upset. And she was describing a situation to me whereby she always felt in the middle of things at school amongst her friendship groups, whereby everybody was giving her information in order that they could support the team. She was doing it in a way that she didn't preach any confidences because she didn't want to fall out with anybody, but also wanted to help them. But she also felt very vulnerable, and she felt very isolated because she felt as though people were confiding in her all the time, but she wasn't necessarily able to confide in them. Anyway, as she became a bit tearful and described these characteristics to me, I realised, having done work on change agents and within the coaching sphere, that actually she was maybe the change agent herself, but she hadn't realised it because she hadn't fully understood the characteristics. I went through some of the characteristics with her as a change agent or a potential change agent, and she got it. She got it immediately. So what we did was we actually wrote them down, and she's now got it on her bedroom wall. So it's quite interesting, isn't it, that even the young can understand these things, and we don't always recognise what we are until it happens. So let's talk about those in a bit more detail. So as a coach and a change leader, we know that we'll always be in a process of self-development. That's critical. We're curious. We're always pushing boundaries. And as I said in the synopsis, pushing boundaries is very important because that's what creates the driving force to allow us to flow and help people. We'll always feel a bit alone and marginal, a bit like my daughter did, because we don't necessarily get help. We can get help, but we have to ask for it. But when we're in the process and in the moment, both as a change leader, we will feel alone because that's what we're there to do. We can't always confide in everybody. We can't always let people know what's going on if we're a leader because certain things have to be kept confidential. And also, by giving people too much information, quite often we can create more problems too. So what else have we got? Well, the other thing you'll find as a change leader, and I've done this, I've been involved in huge cultural transformation projects, both in the UK and abroad for large corporates. You'll feel higher and higher levels of resistance because, of course, the more you push in certain areas, you'll get pushed back. And this goes down to the science again in Newton's laws of physics. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction, but it's important to know that. Because if we don't recognise it, we won't be in a position to deal with it. Also, a coach and a change leader will get more and more understanding and experience of what it means to move in and move out. And what that means is moving into the space and then moving out of the space because of the work that we do. Sometimes it's very important that we have to stand back and observe. We do that as part of the coaching modalities, but sometimes we also need to get, as a change leader, not so much as a coach, we need to get involved and get our hands dirty. I sometimes call it the helicopter and the weeds approach. In the helicopter we see more and we observe more. in the weeds, we can see the detail that's required, and the feeling of moving in and out of not just the process but also the energy in the room is very important. Recognizing that is very important. Recognizing the fact that it won't be static. That also elevates us too. Yes, we'll need to be caring. We'll need to be confrontational sometimes, because otherwise we won't be supporting those changes. We need to be guiding and directive. And quite often, as a coach rather than leader, those are distinct phases through any coaching relationship. Certainly one-to-one, we'll find that we'll have to be quite guiding and directive. In the case of team coaching, then we'll have to be also supportive and emergent, and we'll be having to sit back. Because the key thing about a team coaching experience, and the difference between team coaching and team facilitation, is that you're there really to hold the space. You're there to aid the atmosphere and the space in such a way that the team can actually support themselves. You are not there to find the solution. They will find their own solution. And certainly, again, in some of the lean work that I've done in consulting and productivity work, is that the guys on the ground, they're the process experts. It's not us as the coaches or the change leaders. They're the ones there to make the changes. You'll also find the edge of your patience will get tested. Things will never move fast enough, particularly if you're on a large program and under pressure to make changes. You'll have strong expectations of the team as a change leader, and you'll always be looking for them to move as fast as possible. That doesn't mean that you necessarily push them faster, but you have to show patience. That's part of the process, but you will be frustrated. And what you'll have to do as both a coach and a change leader is learn to deal with that frustration. So you'll find a struggle between doing what is the client needs and what you want to do as a coach, right? Remember, the coaching mantra is always, everything is about the client. So actually that should always take precedence. Doesn't mean that you won't have a struggle, because you will see opportunities. You'll see opportunities to consult, particularly as a coach, and feel as though you should step in. But in reality, you shouldn't step in. What you should do is create the environment such that they can find the solution themselves. And that's what we do with active listening, intuition, and open-ended questions. We avoid diving in and giving the solutions, because we know that even though the process may take longer, it's more sustainable if the client finds the solution themselves. You'll have to be very honest with yourself in order to enable to relate to others, right? Because you're going to have to relate with all sorts of other different people. And in order to do that, you'll need to know your own failings and your own strengths. You need to embrace them and accept them. Otherwise, you run the risk of not engaging in a proper way. You will truly only be yourself when you know yourself. That may sound a bit paradoxical, but it's quite clear. When you actually know yourself, and this is all about self-awareness, you will start to really be yourself. And that is why self-awareness is very, very important in the coaching environment. Your greatest joy will be what you can get others to do, rather than it being about yourself. This ties in and overlaps with the other ones. That's really important. You will get genuine joy for actually helping others, or at least providing the space they can do that. I'm fortunate enough to have done a lot of pro bono mentoring and coaching, as well as acting as a change leader. And I'm currently doing some work via the ICF with the Ambition Institute for senior educators. And I have to say, that's a really rewarding process. That is the thing that brings me the most joy. Sometimes the things that bring you the most joy are not necessarily the things that bring you the most money. And again, this is what you'll find being both a change leader and a coach. Think about it from a change leadership point of view. Quite often, NED's non-executive directors on board are change leaders. They're very influential. Some of them do it pro bono. They're doing because they're giving back. They're not necessarily doing it for the money. Anyway, not all the time. Okay. I think finally we'll just end on a couple of things here at this part here. Is you'll feel uncomfortable with the status quo. And this is what I see with the best change leaders and coaches. You're always looking for that next opportunity. When things seem to have leveled off, then you know that your work is done and it's time to do that in a constructive way. You know, help people with a process such that you don't cause any stress. That's the other thing, is we mustn't push people so far out of their comfort zones into sort of a fear zone that takes them over the edge. But we just need to keep, you know, edging away all the time. And again, I'll use the analogy from my manufacturing experience and the manufacturing world. In lean, one of the things we're always looking for in lean processing is continuous improvement. So that's lots of little baby steps. They all add up to make one big change. The big thing is you don't notice it when you're inside it with small steps. I'll never forget an experience while I was in Holland. We were working with a huge Russian client and we were taking them to see one of our big operating plants and demonstrate what we could do to them in terms of a continuous improvement program. And the plant manager, who was very kindly entertaining us at the time, showed us a graph showing the money that had been saved through continuous improvement on their plant for about 5 years, since about 2007. I think we were there in 2012. And on it there was a straight line with lots of little crosses for all the little projects that they brought online, all contributing. And it had come to a point where I think they'd probably saved $3 or $4 million over that period of the time, which was quite significant and had a huge impact on the bottom line. And I remember one of the client representatives asking a very, very fair question. That question was, how do you know what amount of money was allocated to each project and the individual benefit for each one? And the plant director said quite openly and honestly, he said, I actually don't care, because I'm looking at the direction of travel. I'm looking at the trajectory of what we've done on how we make a difference. I leave it to the team to work out what individual project each one makes. One may make a few $1,000s, one may make $10,000, but it doesn't really matter to me. What I'm looking for is change, active change and cultural transformation. And I think that was really important because the clients were very scientific based and they started to understand the true value of continuous improvement. And again, as coaches and change leaders, that's what we have to do. As soon as we see things plateau, then we've got to look for the next opportunity. And I think the final one, the ones I'm going to talk about today, is quite important. Again, as a coach and a change leader, and as I said right at the start of this discussion, they do overlap quite a lot, is that you tend to see things that others don't. Now, in coaching parlance, we call that intuition. We're always working off our intuition, not solely our intuition, but with active listening, which is very important. Our intuition can be very powerful. We can go with our gut. Having said that, we also need to have checks and balances. We don't want to take unnecessary risks. But the key thing is, what our intuition does is it allows us to see things that other people don't. And mainly, what I find in my work is connections. I can see connections between challenges. I can see connections between opportunities. I can see connections between different industries where the way or an approach in which is solved a problem in one industry can be translated into another one. Because quite often, the other thing here, the corollary of this, is we sometimes see each other when we're in the weeds. We see things as we're all different. Everything looks differently. But when you actually step out and look from further afield, actually a lot of the problems that we see or the challenges we face are very similar. When we see that and we can make connections, life becomes easy or easier because we have less work to do. It becomes more obvious. So seeing these things that other people can't see is a very, very powerful tool. And I remember a vice president that I was working for as part of a big program back in 2013 said that the company had made, we were doing again another lean transformation, had made a very large acquisition. And they were discussing about thought leadership and what programs and systems and stuff that they needed in place. And the senior leader from the company that had been acquired actually said, well, we don't necessarily want your system because we've got our own system and we're different. We're in a different industry. And what the VP said, quite rightly, was, well, actually, I've seen your system. And when you step, it may look different from where you're standing, but when you step outside and look from further afield, they're absolutely the same. And that is a very, very powerful thing. If you can see those sort of connections, then it's just easier to get things done. So I'm just going to round off with a couple of things that I find is quite important. And again, if you look at the characteristics of both a coach and a change leader, and I've used both of those. I've used them in interim management and I've used them as a coach. It is possible to show compassion to your people, right? But also you can have gravitas at the same time. You know, you can empathize and show compassion, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're friends, right? You need to have that respectful distance, particularly as a coach, because obviously you won't. It's a coaching relationship. But even as a leader, you can't be overly friendly or overly engaged, right? And people respect gravitas as well as being compassionate on a one-to-one basis. Sometimes people think the two are mutually exclusive, but in my experience, that's not the case. And again, it's also very useful to come from a perspective of value rather than fear. I find that very, very powerful. I did read somewhere once that the power of want over the power of need can be something like 5 times, and you can relate that to valuing something rather than fearing something. I quite often use the example, going back to my days in industry, whereby people had to go and wear safety spectacles for their own protection, and quite often you go onto the shop floor and you see somebody not wearing them, and then sort of miraculously come from behind a pillar and you see them wearing them again. You know, they don't necessarily, in that case, had valued their eyes. They hadn't made that sustainability leap yet. What they were actually doing was fearing the fact that they may get caught out. And the likelihood of course, them infringing again is pretty high. But when people start to really value their eyes, because they only got one side, they will wear them all the time. And that's just an example of the power of value versus the power of fear. So I use that a lot of the time. Every time I'm faced with difficult situations, I look at what's the value in this, right? Can we always come from a perspective of value rather than fear? And I find that works. Again, both as a historical change leader and also a coach. Well, I hope that's been valuable to you, and I hope you'll pick up the learnings from that. It's been a pleasure doing this podcast. My name's John Coburn Evans. Thank you very much indeed.